Murdorf and the Mortal Flaw, Book 1, Chapter 18, Liberation. Can you fight? Clemenza asked a mace and Sagron. Well, who do you think killed those dervs in the forest? The mace answered. Well, you don't look like much, Navi said, noticing a mace's scrawny arms. You don't look like much yourself, the mace answered. Oh, I like you, kid, Osney chuckled. Catch. He tossed a mace, a sword, and Cosby passed one off to Sagron. But we can't take on all of them, a mace said. What's your plan? Navi felt a rumbling within his soul. Let me make this easy, cronies. Navi stretched out his staff, pointed it towards the berg nestled below. Personally, I'm not up for much of a fight. Then he said, Mistreatment and oppression you surely hate. Let their cruelty come to an end, and let blindness be their fate. Immediately, the invading warriors became sightless. Their daylight turned to darkness. Even shadows evaded them. They were stone-cold blind. Across the village, Awshaks warriors frantically grabbed their eyes, groping about, desperately trying to feel their way around. Proud and arrogant fighters fell to the ground, shouting hysterically, I can't see, I can't see. Now their world was as black as their hearts. You're a prophet, a mace said with excitement. Navi smiled at him. Well, what did you think this was for? He held up his staff. Well, for walking, the mace answered truthfully. What do you think this orb is for? To make you look important, blurted a mace. So if you're really a prophet, you don't even need to know how to use a sword. Boldar Narsni laughed at the boy innocently, insulted Navi. I know how to use a sword, scamp. Navi rolled his eyes again and pushed his purple bandana higher on his head. I've been trying to teach him how to use a sword, said Osney, but he just can't seem to catch on. Oh, watch and learn, crony, watch and learn, Navi said, gripping his sword and gathering his reins. Oh, how I wish I were a prophet, Cosby said, thinking how cool it would be to do supernatural things. Oh, everyone wants to be a prophet, but no one considers the cost and the responsibility. Navi's words were heavy, emphasizing the risk of liability. Cosby was certain he could handle it. It was then that Clemenza noticed that Mongard wasn't wearing his mail. Mongard, where's your mail? Back at the river, answered Mongard. Navi smiled. He understood him. Let's ride, cronies. Digging his heels into Inca, the dragon responded immediately, rushing out to take the lead. As the riders began to ride down the hillside towards the ramparts, Navi stretched out his staff. His words flowed effortlessly as inspiration took over. Let the ground shake, let the walls quake. To the ground let them break. Straightway the ground began to quiver, and the horses went wild, and flying creatures flapped their wings, eager to leave the shaking earth. Easy, easy, the riders said, almost in unison, trying to steady their beast. Clemenza glared at Navi. Couldn't you have come up with something better than that? With confidence, Navi raised his eyebrow, pursed his lip, and grinned as he watched the walls crumble to the ground and watched the tower fall to the ground, burying Awshaks guards beneath the granite rubble. Osney laughed, enjoying Clemenza's frustration with Navi. Oh, it's good to have a prophet along, said Osney. Let's roll, Navi said. Mayhem broke out in the village as the walls fell. Bedazzled Awshaks groped in hysteria. At first the slaves did not know what was happening. Accustomed to being beaten for pausing from their work, most just kept on working. But when they saw opportunity for liberation, they took it, taking up the swords of the Awshaks themselves. Mongard snagged a well-honed sword off a blind warrior and laid claim to it. Dust turned up as the riders rode through the village. Eager for justice, they shattered the chains that bound the colony, liberating them from cruel tyranny of this wrathful people. As the links fell from their weak bodies, their faces shone of renewed hope. With revenge boiling in their blood, the captives took hold of weapons and rose against the Awshaks, seeking reprisal. The new free men stole the enemy's swords and obtained swift revenge. They now held a position of advantage, and they took it. Clemenza and Navi advised the people to leave them in their blind state, a life of hardship considered worse than death. Women sought refuge from the brutes and the bloodshed as they hunkered down behind mounds of crumbled stone and standing buildings. There was disaster and confusion. Instinct drove mothers to run through the dismay, searching for their children. After a momentary spree of revenge, the peasants slowly began to heed Clemenza's advice and release their resentment and put down their weapons. The village lay in ruin, but the people rose free. Perplexed, the people began to search for their family, the people who had made them who they were, the people they loved. The riders ambled over the village, studying the sad human forms that resembled bead poles. Sagron and Amace passed familiar friends and beloved neighbors, a community that accepted them as one of their own. They reached out, took their hands, and squeezed it, was enough to communicate reassurance and compassion. With food being essential for the restoration of these near-starving captives, Navi and Osni set out in search for food sellers. In the meantime, Sagron led Gilmanza to an underground cell, a place he hoped to find his wife. He crossed his fingers that he would find her alive. The underground stera was concealed behind the housing of the gods of the Awshaks headquarters. Sagron held his breath before he lifted the handle. After much prowling, Navi and Osni stumbled upon the magistrate's horse stables. Nothing impressive, remarked Navi. Horses looked well fed and robust. The noise of the ruckus behind the barn grabbed their attention, their curiosity demanding that they explore it. They walked around the back of the cobblestone courtyard behind the stables, where, to their astonishment and Navi's pleasure, they found a magnificent sapphire dragon marked in hues of blue-gray chained in the courtyard. Heavy chains wrapped around all four legs and draped over its scaly body. The thick links were firmly planted in the ground, with 8 pegs hammered into the cobblestone and set with fresh mortar. This set-up had obviously been instigated by the invaders, since the mortar had yet to be stained by age. The dragon couldn't move. She, too, was a victim of the invaders' tyrannical compulsions. They had stripped her of her dignity as a created being, designed to freely soar the heavens in graceful strength and beauty. A creature of divine design, she had been reduced to a prison of chains. Navi was enraged. Such cruelties, Navi thought, were not only a sin against the person or creature, but a sacrilege against its creator. He considered creation a work of divine art to be respected and revered. Creation was good. Innovation was certain of that. It was mortal flaw of sin that had robbed God of his perfect artistry. He wondered what the world was like when all were immortal and everything was in its original beauty. But this was all he knew, a world flawed by humanity. The dragon scowled at them with an accusative glare, its yellow eyes blurred with pent-up anger. "Wow," Navi cried. "Would you look at the beauty of this dragon crony? And in chains! Those good-for-nothing scamps!" "Be careful," Osni warned as Navi began to slowly approach the dragon. "Oh, he's friendly," Navi assured him. "Besides, I have a way with dragons." Navi spoke softly to the dragon, reassuring her that he meant her no harm. "We're here to free you, my scaly little friend," said Navi. The dragon now showed signs of agitation. It snorted and then set its piercing golden eyes upon Navi with qualms of mistrust. Navi sensed vibrations of threat, so he began to slowly back away. A mistrustful glare, a sway of his robust body, a low gurgling in his throat. It was all signs that the dragon was about to blow. Suddenly the dragon breathed a deep breath. Navi had an idea that this dragon was thinking, and he dove to the ground. Soaring flames rolled above his head. He felt the heat of the tongue of the fire flash above him. Hastening to avoid being roasted, Navi banged his injured leg. But the smell of smoking clothes made him shift his attention. He suddenly became aware that smoke was pouring from his head. He reached up to feel the top of his purple hat, but found it burnt out, its edges black and crisp, leaving his head exposed. Osni roared with belly-aching laughter. "I thought you said you had a way with dragons." Navi turned back towards the dragon. "It looks like we're not getting off to a very good start, Scamp." "Maybe you should try a different approach," Osni suggested, laughing. "And what might you suggest?" "Oh, I don't know. Maybe you should turn it into a mouse." "Or," Navi was thinking, "I have a better idea. I think you should try to befriend her while I try to break her chains." Reaching into his pouch, Navi pulled out a piece of dried lizard. "Oh, you can feed her this." "Oh no," Osni argued. "I'm not going near that bloody dragon." Navi poured the pressure on, and eventually Osni caved. He agreed to attempt to befriend the dragon with the dried lizard meat only on the condition if it tried to toast them alive again, Navi wouldn't nag him any more about the beast. Navi agreed. Approaching the beast with his hand open, the dragon became curiously friendly. Osney crept close enough to allow the dragon to eat from his jittery hand. Once the small morsel was gone, however, the dragon immediately became agitated. A lust for more of the leathery meat brought her alive, snorting and huffing. "Look out!" Navi warned him as the first sign that the dragon might explode. Osney ran and dove headlong towards the barn door, narrowly clearing the lick of the flames. He dove to miss the flames, but he landed in a bin of dead salamander and small lizards. The reptiles stunk to high heavens. "Oh!" Osney moaned. Navi chortled, reveling in Osney's misfortune. "It's not funny," Osney protested. "That's it." Navi tried to talk through jittery streams of laughter. Osney pulled himself out of the barrel of dragon food, walking over to Navi and shook his body, splattering the smelly liquid onto the prophet, payback for coercing him into such a daring task. Holding his nose, Navi wrangled Osney into helping him again. Scooting the trough of salamander and lizards over to the dragon, they quickly befriended the beast. She licked her lips and dove in. They patted her and talked softly to the dragon, happily feasting on the smelly appetizers. "Now, while she's eating, let's get those chains off of her," said Navi. "Get the chains off?" Osney inquired. He had heard Navi state his intent earlier, but he had not considered the cost of a free and angry fire-breathing dragon until now. Using the tools Navi discovered behind the shed door, they worked the chains, prying, cutting, and unwrapping. "You know, there's very few dragons left in the world, and we need to help them repopulate." Osney's arm wrestled the chain, working it off the dragon's front leg. "I hope you're not making a mistake." "Oh, not at all. We just need to keep reassuring her that we're not going to harm her," said Navi. He addressed the dragon again. "You're a pretty girl." He watched as the dragon finished off the bucket of smelly salamanders and lizards. She licked her chops, her long tongue extending over her mouth. "I sure hope we have won the fair lady's heart with this disgusting food." Looking over his shoulder at Osney, he had some concern. "I wouldn't stand too close if I were you. She might think you're an overgrown lizard since you smell like one." "Real funny, Navi." Osney stepped away just in case. They stepped back at a safe distance to see what her reaction would be. She seemed to be calming down now that she had been wooed with food, and it looked as though she might show herself to be a trustworthy and friendly dragon. Suddenly, from around the corner, Boldar rushed in. It was unclear who was startled more, the dragon or Boldar. Struck with fear, the dragon breathed a burst of hot fire. Having had some practice, Navi and Osney were quick to dive to safety. Boldar, on the other hand, was just lucky enough that the sight of the agitated dragon scared the wits out of him, for he hit the ground just in the nick of time and the flames soared over his head. It was the odor of singed hair that told him that he lost a few strands. It was the new awareness of the wind on his head that told him that he lost more than a few strands. The stench of scorched hair mingled in the air with the reeking smell of dead reptiles. Scared half to death, he leapt to his feet and bolted back around to the corner, offering a wall of rock for protection against the fiery beast. The sound of mocking filled the air. When he glanced up, Osney and Navi were doubled over with laughter. Reaching up to pat the back of his head, Boldar could fear nothing but stubble. His head looked mangled, long in the front and none in the back. To add to the mood, Navi pointed out that even his horns were scorched a bit. Boldar saw no humor in what he weighed as a near-death experience. Boldar was chafed with irritation. "I have no hair. That bloody dragon burnt off my hair." Navi smirked. "Stylish, very stylish." "Oh, shut up." He had a good idea how absurd he must look. "Win some, lose some, crony. Looks like you lost some," Navi said, laughing. "I was looking for you two," Boldar said, ignoring Navi's joke. "I saw ink outside the gate and figured you must be back here." "That's it, mate, that's it. Nothing can win the fair lady aught like a handsome suitor. A little matchmaking ought to calm our fiery little friend down." "Go get Inca, crony," ordered Navi. In a couple of minutes, Boldar strolled around the corner with Inca, leading her by her reins. The other dragon immediately perked up. At first, it didn't seem like a good idea. The two dragons growled at each other, sizing each other up. After sniffing and getting introduced, they calmed down and slowly warmed up to each other. With the dragon thoroughly distracted, Navi finished wrestling with the chains. His emancipation of the beast was complete. He only hoped it was kind to its liberator. It wasn't long before the dragon willingly strolled off with Inca, the riders trailing behind, happy to have only lost trivial things, namely a hat, some hair, and personal hygiene. "Osney!" Cosby's cry sounded urgent. He yelled again, and this time the cry put fire under their rears. Osney ran out of the courtyard and into the back lot of the palace guard. Navi limped behind them, leaving the two now cooperative beasts under a tree. A hint of light coming from Cosby's torch broke the darkness of the stairwell as they followed him down the stairs. Boldar and Navi walked down the steps of the dungeon. Spotting another torch in the corner of the stairwell, Boldar snatched it up and borrowed a light from Cosby. An unforgiving foul stench greeted them. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, the glow uncovered darkness, casting light on the relics of human form. There was utter silence. Inside the dark dungeon, the casting sheen illuminated human bodies wrapped in chains. Iron links grasped their feet, and unforgiving chains clutched their arms, unrestraining them in the cold and unyielding walls, confining them to a slow death. Their pale faces were frozen in fear, and their hollow eyes lay open wide in death. The riders stood motionless, appalled at the shocking display of pitiless cruelty before their eyes. The shameful display of twisted human forms testified to just how low humankind was capable of sinking. With reservation, they inched close to the frail corpse. At first, they had qualms about touching them, but they knew they needed to check those who looked like they might hold the breath of life in them. Their hearts pounded as they reached out to check for improbable sounds of life. To the touch, the thin layers of clammy flesh were stone cold. The light of the torches flickered, and Sagron held his breath. He hoped his wife was still alive, but the evidence before him made his heart sink. Nadine! Nadine, he thought. Now he began to frantically check from person to person to see if any resembled his wife. He called out her name. They watched him turn into a madman. With torch in hand, Sagron moved close to one of the decomposing corpses. A worm crawled out of the decaying cartilage of the man's nose. Sagron felt his body betray him. Going limp, he fell to the ground. Gamonza and Navi rushed to his aid and helped him up. Not giving him an option, they drug him up the stairs and into fresher air. Her name rolled off of his lips as they towed him unwillingly up the steps. It was in the silence that a faint sound of breathing gave hope to the possibility of life. With the faint light before them, they approached the whisper of life. The glow unveiled the faces of two women side by side, frail and dirty but alive. Their breathing was raveled with death, and their bodies were imbrued with dirt and dried blood, their eyes sunken and their complexions ashen. Indignation boiled in Osney's blood as he raised a hatchet and broke the chains that bound them. The heavy iron fell. Boldar and Mungard picked the two ravished life forms up and gently carried their feral bodies up the stairs and out of the cell. The bodies bore the marks of harsh and inhumane beatings. They could only speculate at what these women had endured. As they carried the women out of the vault, light from the overcast sky revealed a discernible face to Sagron, who had been outside pitching a fit to go back inside the dungeon. "No, it cannot be. This cannot be happening. Nadine!" whispered Sagron. In that moment he suddenly realized that one of these ghastly figures was his beloved wife. He broke loose from Cosby and Navi and ran. "Nadine! Nadine!" Sagron shouted. As they laid her body on the ground, he fell beside her. With emotions no longer pent up, he bent over her lifeless body and cried. Dried blood was caked on the side of her mouth and her clothes. The lines on her face looked like valleys, canyons filled with grief. He wanted to embrace her, but he could not. It would cause her too much pain. Although bleeding, dirty, and thin, she was at least alive. Just barely. "I'm so sorry, Nadine." Tears streamed down his face as he spoke. He felt the need to explain to her what happened the night of their planned escape. I saw you coming up the hillside to meet us when that guard grabbed you. I wanted to go down there and kill him, but I couldn't, for Amace's sake. There were just too many of them. I'm so sorry, Nadine. I should have never planned this. Sagron lamented, wailing over his wife. Friends began to gather around him, neighbors he considered family. He stroked her head as someone brought water. Sagron dipped tiny droplets onto her lips, but she did not respond. Her eyes seemed fixed. She stared, but never blinking. It was then that they realized that the darkness had overtaken her, for she was blind. Just yards away stood a mace. He cut the chains from the wrist that bound one of his own people. Then he surveyed the village. It was then that he saw his father kneeling beside someone on the ground with the riders and friends huddled around them. Then he saw Sagron wipe the tears. Mother, he thought. In that moment, he sprinted across the village, pushing desperate villagers to the side. Mama, Mama! His heart raced. His riders respectfully stepped aside to let the young man through to the only parents he had ever known. With buckling knees, Amace fell to the ground. He held her fragile hand. Her labored breathing turned to a death rattle. Mama, Mama, don't die! Amace wept openly, allowing himself to feel the pain. He cried, unable to hold back the tears of his broken heart. He squeezed her hand again, wishing she could hear him say, I love you, one last time. The words left his lips unconsciously. He always wondered what would have become of him had Sagron and Nadine not stumbled upon him. But he also had a gut feeling, perhaps intuition, that finding him was no accident. It was meant to be. After many tears, Sagron laid his wife's lifeless body on the ground. Kissing her on the cheek, Sagron sobbed as his beloved wife drew her last breath. Holding his wife tenderly, Sagron regretted that he had planned the escape. His face twisted with remorse as he wet the ground with his tears. He had loved her to the end. Sagron stood up slowly and purposefully. Gripping the hilt of his sword, he extracted it from its sheath and planted it firmly in the ground. A fireplace is meant for fire, as hell is meant for a son of hell. New forms lined across his face of anger and revenge. In that moment, Sagron fulminated, plotting revenge. His face was flushed, enriched with rage as he screamed from the top of his lungs. Tightening his grip on his hilt of his sword, he jerked the sword from the ground. Mad as a hornet, he went on the warpath, slaying the sightless heathens as they groped around his village. He spotted an Awshak warrior wandering aimlessly around in a blind panic. Sagron ran full speed ahead and struck the man's sword. The blade flew out of the man's trembling hands. Snatching the man by his hair, he yelled at him, See what you have done? Do you see what you've done? We are poor people who work the land and mind our own business. You have crushed us all. Don't you see? Raising his eyes, Sagron noticed another warrior near him. The man was swinging his sword just as wildly as the other man. Sagron forced the second man to the ground and slammed his sword against the blade, knocking it from his hand. He would deal with him later. Clutching the first warrior by the throat, Sagron yelled, Of course you don't see. You didn't see when you could see. A heart as pitch black as yours never sees light, never feels remorse, never has a conscience of pity towards others. I wonder if light ever reaches into hell, or remorse is ever learned in hell. He thrust his sword into the man with satisfaction. Mouth agape, the man's glossy eyes stared vacantly back with no understanding. The dying man wrapped his hands around the cold sword that had warmed his heart. Losing grip on his sharp blade, the man fell limp to the ground. Now turning towards another Awshak who trembled as he knelt on his knees, Sagron slammed his sword into the ground beside the man, sending the fright of death up the man's spine. He had something he wanted to say to him too. How does it feel to be on the other side? He asked. Thrusting the man backwards, he watched him sink to the ground in fear. Sagron went on a warpath, but only momentarily. His sword drew out the blood of wicked men. Then it was over. He stopped. Now feeling empty, but somehow a little sated, Sagron stood still in a daze. A mace walked over to him, planted his hand firmly on his father's shoulder. That didn't do much good, did it? No, I guess not, son. Leave them in their darkness, advised the mace. Let them live with what they have done. Perhaps they will grow a conscience. Come on, Sagron, said Gamonza, patting him on the shoulder. Let's go get you some water. Navi weighed in on a vindictive idea. Observing some Awshaks groping around in their blindness, revenge stirred within his bones. Rubbing his stubbly face, he ignored his conscience and proceeded with his devilish plan. Approaching a group of Awshaks, he pretended himself to be an agent of good. Here, let me help you. Inside he stirred with what he reclassified as justifiable reprisal. Follow me and I will lead you to the palace god's housing. Naively, the ill-discerning warriors began to follow him blindly. Coaxing them along with the deceptive voice of kindness, Navi led them to the dank and dark cell. Just follow my voice right this way. Cosby and Mongard, Voldar and Osney applauded the idea and quickly became accomplices. What are you doing? The men protested the moment they smelt the vile stench of death. Forcing the men down, Navi and Cosby chained their wrists in a barbaric iron contraptions the warriors had designed for the peasant people. You like chaining people and letting them rot? Let's see how you like it, you sorry fools. Oh, go to hell, replied one of them. Navi punched the man in the face. Navi didn't feel guilty as he walked out of the cell. The lives they had taken no one could give back. But when he heard a voice within him say, let it go, Navi, he knew he had to release the hatred. Then he had to release the men. Enjoy your stay, Cosby echoed. He enjoyed taunting them and took delight in the feeling of indisputable power he held over them. The accommodations have everything you need. A pail of water over here. Cosby tapped the edge of the metal pail the man was clearly unable to reach. Toilet conveniently beneath you and a bed right where you sit. He was clearly enjoying his position of superiority over someone for a change. You can't leave us here like this. We were only following orders, said the men. Cosby punched the man for fun of it. Well, now you can follow my orders. Rot in hell. The experience was empowering, and Cosby loved it. Before he left, he gave the man one last swift kick. Navi, however, admitted his wrong and persuaded Cosby to do the right thing and be the better man. I was wrong, said Navi. We're not like them. Let them go. Let them go, Cosby protested. You're going to restore their sight and build them a palace too? Cosby said sarcastically. Oh, they remain blind, but we will not stoop to their level, Navi clarified. After exchanging words, Cosby reluctantly released the men from the chains. Navi could see in his orb that Skeeter had been injured and that they were held up for a day or so in the land of the giants until Skeeter was well enough to ride. It was fortunate that even though they couldn't speak to one another through the orbs, the prophets could at least see what was happening with each other. Navi knew they had some time to play with, so they decided to stay a few days and help the people. The riders gathered around a cluster of trees. Why do you have that dumb dragon with you anyway? Voldar asked, staying clear of her. I can't just leave her. Besides, Inga likes her. Well, you can't bring it along. There's no one to ride her. She doesn't need anyone. She's following Inga wherever he goes. Navi pulled his half-burned-out hat out of his pocket and stuck it on his head. What happened to your hat, Navi? Mongard laughed at the burned-out remains. I'm lucky this scamp of a dragon didn't make me a pile of ashes, crony. Now getting a whiff of Osney, Gamonza wrinkled his nose. What the heck is that smell? You smell like something dead. Navi about got me killed with that stupid dragon, Osney said, eyeballing him. Those dragons think you smell good, Voldar said, noticing them following him. It'll wear off, Osney assured them, ever the optimist. Just keep your distance from them and from me. Or one of these dragons might think he is a giant pickled salamander and eat him, said Cosby, laughing. What the heck happened to your hair? Mongard asked Voldar, laughing. Navi and Osney nearly killed me too with that bloody dragon. Well, in time it'll grow back, Osney said, giving his bald head a rub with his knuckles. As inappropriate as the laughter might have seemed under the conditions of such human suffering, the writers needed a diversion from the grave conditions they had just beheld. Meanwhile, just ahead of them would be days filled with wearisome efforts to restore health, food, and dignity back to this simple community that had suffered so wrongfully. They would offer them all they could in the short time they had.